Hello and welcome. The images of torture at Abu Ghraib prison continue to haunt the US military, even though America passed on control of the facility nearly a year ago. Horrifying stories of the techniques military investigators used to extract information from those unfortunate enough to end up there are still coming to light. I should warn you that some of those disturbing pictures will be revisited during this show. In the autumn of 2003, a few months after the invasion of Iraq, Iraqi prisoners were being subjected to disturbing violence, abuse and humiliation away from the eyes of the outside world. Then in January 2004, US Army Specialist Joseph Darby handed over some of these images to the Army's Criminal Investigation Command, which launched an investigation. 3 months later, the US network CBS and weekly magazine The New Yorker published pictures revealing the extent of the suffering inside the notorious prison. Abu Ghraib, which was built by British contractors in the 1960s, about 30 kilometers west of Baghdad, was used by the former Iraqi President Saddam Hussein. After the US invaded Iraq in 2003, thousands of Iraqis were detained there by American forces. Well, today we talk to an eyewitness of the legacy of Abu Ghraib. Tony Lagaranis admits he took part in the abuse of Iraqis as an interrogator for the US Army when he was sent there in 2004. He left the Army soon after and was one of the first to publicly speak out about the techniques he observed or used. Earlier this month, he published his account in Fear Up Harsh, an Army interrogator's dark journey through Iraq. In it, he details the culture of abuse that he found when he arrived in the country. Don't forget, we take your questions and comments on this show, and you can reach us at the numbers in the bottom of your screen. Tony Lagaranis, I want to welcome you in from Chicago. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
I've got to start off by asking you, what was it that made you tell all? What was it that made you write so candidly about what happened and what you were involved with in Abu Ghraib?
Well, initially I went to the media before I even thought about doing a book. As soon as I got back from Iraq, I was extremely angry at the Army for putting us in a position to do these things and to order us to do these things. And they told us that these harsh tactics that we were using in interrogations were legal. We were told that by the Pentagon through a memo. And we felt betrayed. When the Abu Ghraib scandal came out, then the Pentagon, they backed off and they said that, you know, none of these techniques were authorized. So we felt betrayed and we were angry at the Army.
Well, you were effectively the first to break that code of silence on what was going on there and explaining what was happening behind closed doors within the military. What price did you pay for breaking that code of silence?
Well, fortunately, I didn't commit any of those abuses at Abu Ghraib, and the Army didn't want to expand the scandal. They didn't want to show that these abuses were systemic, which they were. They were happening all over Iraq. I interrogated in different facilities all over Iraq, and these techniques were being used all over the place. So if they had tried to prosecute me for committing these abuses, then they would have shed light on their own practices. So the Army left me alone, and in fact they quietly ushered me out of the Army on a medical discharge.
Now I wonder, you know, when you go through what you went through, what you're trained to do, where is the line drawn between interrogation and torture?
Well, in training it was very clear. We had to follow Geneva Conventions, and Geneva Conventions say that there can be no negative repercussions for a detainee who is not cooperating. They always have to be treated humanely and fairly, and we couldn't threaten a detainee explicitly or tacitly. We couldn't harm them in any way. However, when we got to Iraq, we were told that Geneva Conventions did not apply to the detainees we had. So they gave us a new set of rules on a document called the Interrogation Rules of Engagement, and that listed very harsh tactics, including isolation, using military working dogs, stress positions. We would induce hypothermia. That was on the list. So they were clearly violating Geneva Conventions with this document.
I wonder, Tony, you know, from what you write, the rules were being bent at the prison, but not just being bent, I should say, but probably literally thrown out of the window. And I wonder what were the limits. At what point did the Army say, okay, this is the line you mustn't cross?
Well, as soon as the scandal broke, all of those harsh tactics got shut down, at least in the facilities that I worked at. We weren't allowed to do those anymore. However, what happened after that was that the torture moved from the prisons and from the professional interrogators to the field. So when a unit would do a raid on a house, for instance, they would stay in the house and torture the detainees and interrogate them in the house before they were registered into the prison, because they felt like the spotlight wasn't on them, and they didn't have the pressure to clean up these practices. And sometimes they were much harsher. They would simply beat them or burn them. We had detainees with broken bones and smashed feet and third-degree burns, and those were all sustained during interrogation.
I know you write in your book, Fear Up Harsh, that really it didn't ultimately achieve anything significant for the military to use some of these tactics. And we had an email that came in from Mike in Canada. He's in British Columbia in Canada. Mike says, does torture work as an effective method for getting the truth out of detainees, or does it induce its subject to say what they believe the interrogator wants to hear?
In my experience, torture never worked. I never got any intelligence. Either they would lie to me or they would simply clam up and refuse to speak at all. And if you look at studies done by professional interrogators, for instance, studies done by the CIA, the FBI, and the American military, they all say that torture does not work. It's completely ineffective. The only people who are saying that torture works seems to be the civilian leadership in the United States, like Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, and Roberto Gonzalez, who've never had experience with interrogation at all.
Now, your book refers to, you know, your dark journey through Iraq, and I wonder what for you was your darkest moment there?
Well, I don't know about the darkest moment, but I mean, certainly having participated in these abuses for months was a horrible thing that I still have to deal with. But also that we had so many people who were innocent in Iraq that we were pushing through this bureaucratic judicial system that was barely set up. It was completely unfair. At least 90% of the people that I dealt with were completely innocent. There was no evidence against them, barely a suspicion of a crime, and we couldn't release them from the prisons. They would simply get sent up to Abu Ghraib and languish there for months or a year or more.
And you were saying that, and you were saying in your writing that ultimately all your efforts to complain to the chain of command and higher up the chain of command really went nowhere.
No, I complained up through my chain of command, and I also complained to CID, which is the Criminal Investigations Department of the Army. I issued sworn statements and memos, and those things literally disappeared. When I got out of the Army and I started speaking to the media, CID came to me, an investigator from Criminal Investigations came to me, and he said, why didn't you issue any sworn statements with us and tell us about the abuse? But I had filed multiple abuses in different locations and at different times, and they said that they had nothing for me. So, you know, you can imagine what's going on there with these investigations. It's a useless process.
Well, I'd like to put you another email that we got here. This one came from Cairo in Egypt, where Ahmed Lashin wrote to us across the email, and he said it's quite a great phenomenon to find cases such as such in which officials are driven by their conscience disclose the hidden. But the question is, how does the American public receive these revelations? What reaction have you had from people in the US to what's been revealed in your book and what in the media?
Well, let me say first that the people that I worked with received it extremely well. I've received nothing but support from the interrogators that I worked with in Iraq. But the right wing attacked me initially. They said that the things I was saying was unsubstantiated. They said I was a liar. Later they couldn't say that because there was so much documentation that proved what I was saying was right. And now they attack me by saying that you know, I'm too soft and that this kind of torture is necessary and it's the right thing to do. And I was like a panty waist liberal, and I couldn't do my job properly.
And to what extent do you think your book and what it's revealing is compromised by virtue of the fact you had to, or you did, send it to the Department of Defense for checking?
It wasn't compromised at all. They made no changes at all. The only reason that we submitted it to them was to make sure that we didn't reveal any classified information, and they sent it back to us and said that we were fine.
It's intriguing to read in your book. You talk about the briefing you had in preparation for going to Iraq, and it made me think, you know, in this time where sensitivity is such an important issue, you were told about the Arab mind, and even the briefing was based on the Arab mind, based on the book by Raphael Patai. And that has its two premises seem to be that Arabs understand only force, and that the biggest weakness of Arabs is humiliation and shame. And based on your experience in the Arab world, how do you regard this preparation that you had?
Well, I mean, that briefing that we had was just absolutely ridiculous, completely just pure racism. They told us that Arabs are born liars, that they lie very naturally, that they can't think logically, that you know, they only respond to violence. I mean, it was absolutely ridiculous. And you heard this repeated also, that, you know, Arabs have this inordinate fear of dogs, and that sexual humiliation is very powerful, Arabs. But that's true for anyone. Who isn't afraid of a growling, barking dog when you're restrained with handcuffs? And who is, you know, who would enjoy the sexual humiliation that these people were subjected to? It's, you know, it was pure racism what they were telling us.
I just heard that we've got a call on the line there, Tony, from Anwar in London, who's got a question for you. So, Anwar, go ahead.
Assalamu alaikum, Riz. Good evening to Ralph. Ralph, you know, your book, the point which I want to ask you to tell me is, you know, Arabs ruled up to Spain, you know, up to the 8th century. They ruled entire areas. So you cannot say that, you know, Arabs are basically it is in their genes or in their metabolism, this sort of thing.
I think Anwar, yeah, Anwar, I think that's actually that Tony is saying that briefing didn't actually didn't refer to that at all. And I wonder, based on an email we had from Deborah Plummer in Kansas, Tony, this came in from the US, and Deborah says, how would you change the system so that this doesn't happen again?
Well, you know, the military is structured, it's very rigidly structured, and if the leadership says that, you know, if they lay down clear rules about what interrogators can and can't do, and lay down clearly that abuses will not be tolerated, abuses will not happen. And I saw that as I moved around Iraq and I worked with different units. If we had a strong commander who had clear directives, abuse didn't happen in these detention facilities. So we simply need a change in our leadership. And I really think it's coming from the civilian leadership. I don't think that the military asked permission to torture. I don't think they wanted to do this. I think it came straight from the Pentagon.
So where do things stand with Guantanamo Bay? Of course, there's a big question over the way things are going on there. How do you think that mirrors what happened at Abu Ghraib?
Well, we were certainly using a lot of the same techniques that came out of they were using in Guantanamo. They migrated. I was working with interrogators who'd worked there. General Miller himself came from Guantanamo to Abu Ghraib and transferred some of the techniques. But I've never been to Guantanamo myself, so I can't really say exactly what's happening there.
I wonder, what about the secret, alleged secret detention centers the U.S. has offshore, so to speak? I wonder what you might know about those and what goes on there.
Again, I've never been to those places. You know, the only place I deployed with the military was to Iraq, so I can't really speak about those.
Now, can you see, based on your training and so on, and what was needed in terms of military strategy, can you see any argument that condones any kind of actions that were used? I mean, I know the expression torture light came up as well, that this was a sort of interrogation in a much more aggressive way. Can you see anything that condones the need to use these kind of tactics?
No, not at all. And they're trying to narrow the definition of torture so that these harsh tactics like waterboarding and these other things can be used and not call them torture. However, most of these tactics that we were using that they call torture light were developed by the Soviet Union, and they found them to be very effective in breaking down a human being. Not necessarily effective in gaining intelligence, but they wanted simply domination over a person. And at that time, when the Soviet Union was using these things, we called it torture. And now we've adopted them directly from the Soviet Union, and we're trying to say that it's not torture.
Now, Tony, it's interesting to see where you are now. Of course, you'd traveled the world, you'd had a real desire to learn Arabic, and that was one of the key reasons you went into the military as well. And it makes me wonder, you know, considering what you went through, what impact has it had on you personally? I mean, what kind of psychological issues have you had to face based on what you went through Abu Ghraib?
Well, when I first got back from Iraq, I had a complete breakdown. I ended up in the emergency room with panic attacks, and you know, I hadn't slept for days and days. I mean, I was feeling intense guilt and trying to reconcile the things that I had done and seen with the person that I thought I was and wanted to be. And I continue to struggle with that now. I mean, it's certainly gotten better, but you know, I feel like I have a real responsibility to speak about these things and try and change our policies as a result of what I've been through.
Well, Tony Lagaranis, thank you very much for joining us here to talk about your book, Fear Up Harsh. That is the book, and you can find that in bookstores around the world now. On the next show, the 7 wonders of the ancient world have more or less disappeared, with the exception of the pyramids in Egypt, and we'll talk to the man who's led a global campaign to vote for the new 7 wonders of the world, from the Great Wall of China to the statue of Jesus overlooking Rio de Janeiro. Don't forget, you can send us your questions and comments in advance. The email address is riz@aljazeera.net. We'll see you next time. Street Talk's coming up.